Just a quick heads up before we start. On Sandwiched, we talk honestly about life, loss, and caregiving. That means conversations may touch on topics such as death and grief. We invite you to listen with care, and please do step away if you need to. Hi there. Welcome to the first episode of Sandwiched. My name is Paul H. Richardson Jr., and I'm your host. It's my extreme pleasure to be sharing stories with you about life, love, and loss. Sandwiched is a podcast for caregivers, by caregivers. It's my pleasure to be your host, and I can't wait for you to hear more. Sandwiched was born out of lived experience. So as you can see, if you're watching, I actually am wearing a shirt of Tumbleweed. So Tumbleweed is an end-of-life planning and caregiver-focused platform to help support folks navigating aging, loss, and unfortunately sometimes death. But what we found through building Tumbleweed was a real gap in the market. Family caregivers often feel alone, lots of isolation, exhaustion, sadly, sometimes burden, and they don't know what to do. And so in talking to our customers, we said, you know what? We need to get these stories out into the world. People who are family caregivers, people who have experienced loss, people who are sandwiched between it all and just trying to honestly keep it together. And so that's why Sandwiched was born. It was born out of conversations with real people who are using services like Tumbleweed and other platforms. And it said, hey, you know what? Let's create something that we can actually share with the rest of the world. And maybe we can get in front of folks who are experiencing this themselves, who don't know where to go and what to do. So that was kind of the early ideation of Tumbleweed. And it's my extreme pleasure to get started and to have these conversations. You can expect to have guests from all walks of life. Some of our guests experienced caregiving, loss, grief very early, others later in life. Maybe they were helping a parent or a grandparent, a sibling, a friend. And interestingly enough, a lot of our stories actually even sometimes neighbors. So we are going to be bringing you stories from across the spectrum, from around the globe, to actually share those with you and to make you know that we're not in this alone. We are in this together. So let's get started. So some of you out there might be wondering, what is Sandwiched? What is the sandwich generation? And why Sandwiched? Why is the podcast named Sandwiched? Let's break it down. So first and foremost, a little about me. I actually have realized that I have been a part of the sandwich generation most of my life, probably earlier than most. So the sandwich generation is defined as adults who are currently caring for an aging person, parent, grandparent, friend, spouse, neighbor, and others, maybe children, could be siblings, it could be pets. And so it's really being sandwiched between all of those things. Also, while they're trying to manage work, career, building business, etc. And so that's where we have really identified is those folks need to find services and support and resources. And ultimately, that's what launched the Sandwich Podcast. So when I was trying to identify what should we call this podcast, a lot of things went through our mind. But ultimately, it came down to we need it to be something that's easy and simple, but also is memorable. Sandwiched. We are all sandwiched, and it's getting more and more complex for most of us. Everyone's sandwich stories looked a little bit different. You know, some stories, it's very kind of the traditional sandwich generation. I'm caring for my parents, and I also have children. That's kind of the traditional, but honestly, we're finding that sandwich stories are even more complex. People who are caring for their nieces and nephews, people who are caring for an adult sibling who lives with a mental illness, or like myself, I've been a caregiver for my mom since I was actually very young. My mom was first institutionalized. She lived with mental illness when I was 12 years old. And so I've been on this journey now for over 30 years. It's complex, it's overwhelming, and it can sometimes really feel like, gosh, this is going to burn me out. And how do I ensure that doesn't happen? Because I care about my mother. We care about our families. And how do we ensure that we don't burn out? And so that's really kind of the background of Sandwiched. And also too, just from a kind of a numbers standpoint, it's estimated today that 1 in 5 adults are part of the sandwich generation. And that's jumping to 1 in 4 in the next 2 years, and then 1 in 3 by 2040. Our aging population, especially here in the US, is fantastic. They're wonderful. However, kind of the negative side of things is that although people in the US are living longer, we're not living longer healthier. There's a lot more issues, comorbidities, that we have to navigate. And so a lot of that pressure is actually coming on the family caregivers. They're stepping up, whether it's through helping them with navigating services, coordination of appointments and visits, and in home care, and sometimes financial and logistical. And so, how do we kind of get all those things pulled together and help them navigate this process? So, that's what we're going to be diving into here. And honestly, every story is going to be a little bit different. And that's the point. We want people to realize that not every sandwich life is the same. My sandwich life is not the same as your sandwich life, is not the same as our next guest sandwich life. But let's listen and look for how we actually can learn from each other and find resources together. So just to kind of put some economics to the sandwich generation and family caregivers supporting our aging population, the Rand Corporation estimates that 522 billion, yes, billion dollars are lost annually because a lot of family caregivers either have to sometimes miss work, go part-time, and in some situations, especially if we think about aging population living with dementia, Alzheimer's, or some of the more complex disease states, they sometimes have to leave work altogether. And so that means that $522 billion in lost wages. That also impacts economics across the United States. In addition, it's estimated that almost $300,000 is lost in retirement savings for these family caregivers. So when we're talking about the sandwich generation and caring for our aging parents, grandparents, friends, or neighbors, it's not just about the impact today, it's about the impact across the globe and also financially. Resources are tight, funds are limited. A lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck, and this is only making things harder. So, how did I get into the family caregiver space? Well, it's probably helpful if I actually share honestly with all of you that it was only about 2 years ago that I even actually realized, wow, I'm a caregiver, which in hindsight sounds a little bit silly, but I think that for a lot of us, that's often how it happens. We have been doing a role for some period of time. And in my case, since I was a preteen and it was just so ingrained in my nature that it really took some deep reflection and actually the building of Tumbleweed to identify that, oh, wow, I've been a family caregiver most of my life. I talked about that I am a family caregiver for my mother. My mother lives with mental illness. She has most of her life. Me and my sisters have navigated this journey. I'm the eldest. And so I have been the primary caregiver for my mom throughout her life over the last 30 plus years since I was a young person. And it was only a couple of years ago that I realized that, oh my gosh, I'm actually a family caregiver, which in some sense, as I look back, has actually been a little bit healing because I often felt overwhelmed and I didn't know what to do or how best to support her. And honestly, that's even today. Mental illness doesn't go away. And, there are ups and downs. There are good days and bad days. There are good years and bad years. And so, that's really where I started to step in. In addition, my parents are very young. And the benefit of that is that I got to know my grandparents and my great grandparents. On the flip side, as my grandparents were starting to age, I stepped into a caregiver role with them. My aunt was the primary caregiver for my grandparents on my mom's side, and I was kind of a secondary for a few reasons. At the time, I spent 20 years in healthcare. So I understood the healthcare industry from the administrative side. But also, too, I understood some of the language and how insurance worked, at least at a high level. And so I would help my aunt with calling when we were looking at getting our grandparents into an assisted living. And then my grandfather's memory was getting really bad. And so we needed assisted living with access to memory care. Right. And so there was lots of calls and are beds available and when can we move them in? And then, oh, by the way, what makes it more complex is they also have a reverse mortgage, which was a whole other situation, which we will dive into in future episodes, I imagine. But it's just very complex. And so the biggest thing that I realized as a family caregiver is one, resources matter, connections matter, and knowing you're not alone matters. My aunt was the primary caregiver, as I shared with my grandparents, and her and I still talk today about some of those situations, how it was difficult to navigate it, some of the regrets that even both of us have. But I think we have to remind ourselves and give each other grace in that we're going to make mistakes. We're human. Caregiving is something that is often 24/7. It's relentless, and we just got to do our best. And so I hope that in our stories, as we dive into sandwich stories, that you will find something meaningful,
You will find value. And with time, you'll realize that you're not alone. If it's 1 in 5 today, and it's going to be 1 in 4 in a couple of years, that means that 25% of our population is going to be a family caregiver. So let's do this together. So you might be asking yourself, why now? And how did you get here? So I guess a little bit of backstory from myself is that I have been actually ideating on what eventually became the Sandwich podcast for a good maybe 3 or 4 years now. I always had the interest and desire to bring stories to the world. I just didn't know what topic exactly and how. And so that was kind of the early idea. One of the things about being a startup founder that we learn is the importance of what's called customer discovery. And customer discovery really means when you're building a product, so Tumbleweed is a technology solution, you take it to customers and you get feedback or potential customers. And so that's called customer discovery. And so it was in April of 2025, earlier this year, I had 4 different conversations, some with customers and actually one with a partner about some of the pain points, navigating, caregiving, aging, end of life planning, but also to kind of the burden and the loneliness that a lot of them expressed. And it was coming out of those 4 conversations in 1 week where I was like, now's the time. We have got to get these stories into the world because the words I kept hearing was, I feel so alone. I'm about to break. I don't know how to talk to this. I remember one conversation with a woman who was caring for her kids. I think one of the kids is in college, but also her aging parents who were living in the West Coast and she was in the South and having to relocate them. And she's like, there was no place to go, no one to talk to. And I was like, we've got to get these stories. And that's what eventually created Sandwiched. And so we knew as a team that, okay, this is a topic, we're going to bring it together and get it into the world. And so we went into build mode. So we actually brought in some summer interns from the University of Iowa who were bringing in not only support and experience from podcast space, from working in videography and marketing, but really we got to get creative and help us put together how are we going to launch this podcast? How are we going to connect it to our work at Tumbleweed? Because I didn't want it to be just that Tumbleweed podcast. That's not the goal. It's really all about sandwiched lives and sandwich stories. And Tumbleweed is kind of the engine that powers it in the back end. And so that's really kind of what happened. And so for the last 3.5 months now, we've been working in the background in preparations and in recruitment. Luckily, because I've had so many friends and colleagues and potential customers who are navigating the sandwich life, we have a huge repository we're able to connect with folks to invite them in to be our guests. And so we've been recording now for about 2 months. And if I think about what I've learned so far in the conversations that we're excited to start sharing with you today on our first episode of Sandwiched is everyone's story is unique and there's also a lot of similarities, in every conversation and all of the sandwich stories that we've had are very different than mine. Their experiences are different. I had 6 people pass away in the course of 6 years, which working in healthcare, I have a different lens on death and dying. To me, death and dying are a part of life, right? But I know for a lot of folks, that's not the case. But I think that was influenced by some of my younger experiences, me facing my own mortality, and then also, working in healthcare. But that's not the case for most people. And so a lot of the conversations, different things will trigger different experiences that I've had or experiences that my family members have had or conversations that I've heard from other professionals. And so I think at the end of the day, while each of our lived experiences are our own, I think we also can glean a lot of value from, oh, wow, the way that guest approached a given situation is not how I would have thought about it. But you know what? I'm really impressed by it. And I wonder if I can bring that into my own life. And so I believe that, while every story is unique, at the end of the day, we have a lot of common ground. We have a lot we can learn from each other. And kind of my hope as we continue to, launch a new show every Friday is that people will find episodes that resonate with them more. They will find connection in like, oh my gosh, this is my story. And also too, for folks who want to potentially join us as a guest, email us. Please reach out to podcast@tumbleweedplan.com. I'd love to have you on as a guest and to share your story. Because at the end of the day, and I say this all the time, we are better together. There are so many things that I'm excited to share with you. I think that for me personally, what I have found is I am actually finding healing and growth in every conversation. There are parts of myself that I didn't even know I still was holding on to some grief or a little bit of resentment or maybe even some pain from different situations in my past. And I'm finding these sandwich conversations are allowing me to step into a space with other people and to hold space for them. And a lot of the guests are holding space for me too. Because what I'm finding is once people have experienced kind of the family caregiver journey or a death or multiple deaths, we understand life, I don't say differently, but I think we lean into life a little bit different. And so for me personally, I think this has been a very healing process. And also too, it's been a joyous experience, right? I get to bring people's lived experience and share their voices and stories with the world. One that specifically sticks out is, as you're going to hear actually later today in one of our episodes, is our guest Anise and Deb talking about their own journey with death and dying. Anise lost her husband and her mother within 18 days. And we were talking about kind of the signs that and symbolisms that she would find after, right? After their passing. And it reminded me to reflect on, Tumbleweed on that side of the world. It was launched while I was on a road trip and I was grieving the loss of my grandparents. Well, coincidentally, my grandfather's empty urn and one of my grandmother's costume jewelry necklaces happened to end up in the RV with me on this trip. And I ended up doing a memorialization of them in their hometowns back in Iowa. And it was totally kismet, right? It was unexpected. I don't know if deep down I had planned in my subconscious that I was going to do something. Certainly was not in the forefront of my mind by any means, because when I found his urn and her necklace, it really made me laugh out loud. But it also, too, was a moment where I felt so comfortable and welcome and vulnerable to share with Anise and Deb and with all of you that story, a story of I was holding on to some grief and did a little burial celebration in the middle of Iowa a couple of years ago. 3 words that I would describe my sandwiched life: never ending, trying to find peace, and gifts. So gifts, I never would have imagined that my life as a family caregiver and someone who has been sandwiched between a lot at different points in my life would have launched a podcast or a startup from that experience. But both Sandwiched and Tumbleweed were born from these lived experiences. So while it has a lot of challenges with it, it has also brought a lot of gifts. And I'm very grateful for that. Even with the stuff where sometimes it is never ending, that's okay. It reminds me that I'm still growing and learning, and there's more work to do for me. And there's also more work to do for you and for our customers. So I think for me, it's brought me a lot of gifts. So as we wrap up episode 1, this is probably one of the only, well, we'll see in the future, episodes where it's going to be just me talking. But we really wanted to welcome you to Sandwiched. We want to share with you how we ended up here, what the journey's been like, and also what you can expect, right? And part of what you can expect is help us learn what would be resonant with you, right? You can reach out anytime. Again, podcast@tumbleweedplan.com. Share insights, share reflections, engage with us on social media. We want it to resonate with the world. And so that means that engaging with folks like yourself. So reach out anytime and put in the subject line Sandwiched, SANDWICHED. So welcome to episode 1 of Sandwiched. So excited that you're here to be with us and to learn and to listen and to grow together. We've got 2 more episodes that are dropping today. First one will be with Anise and Deb, and the next one will be with Gary. So please join us every week, Friday, for Sandwiched. And remember, just because you're in the middle doesn't mean you're alone.
Sandwiched is a Second Act Studio production with support from Tumbleweed. We couldn't do this without the support of our production team, Maddie Willis, Brennan Plank, and our interns. Eileen O'Doherty, and Anthony Cano. Thanks for listening, and remember, you are not alone. Have a great one.